My name is Wamkele Mene, Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I have been in trade negotiations my entire adult life. I was at the Ministry of Trade of South Africa for a long time, dealing with WTO issues and also regional trade agreements, SADC, Free Trade Area, as well as the tripartite free trade area. So that's all I've done in the last almost 2 decades now. Well, the rationale is a very compelling one because the character of Africa's economy is one that in general terms can be characterized as fragmented, smallness of national economies. Most of our economies are too small to be globally competitive individually. We have a lack of efficiencies, or rather lack of economies of scale, and many of us continue to export primary commodities to countries of the north, and we don't trade nearly enough with one another in value-added production. There is some, but it's not to the point where we actually would boost intra-Africa trade and enhance Africa's industrial development capacity. So the heads of states looked at this condition of Africa and said that we have to take concrete steps to reverse the situation, to place Africa on a path for industrial development and the ability of Africa for value-added production. It's very important that we move away from this over-reliance when we're exporting to the rest of the world. We move away from this over-reliance of primary commodities, or rather export on primary commodities, reliance on the export of primary commodities. Very, very important. And so this is the underlying rationale. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a first step towards making Africa globally competitive. Without an industrial development capacity, a country or a region will never be able to be competitive. You will not be able to create jobs, you will not be able to attract investment. You will continue to be stuck in this mode of forever being on the periphery of the global economy. And I, as an African, I find that unacceptable that we continue to be at the periphery of the global economy. And so I think we have to do something about it ourselves, not anybody else, but ourselves as Africans have to improve our own condition of our continent. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but we need a starting point. And if you look at countries that have developed, that have industrialized, you can trace it back to 30, 40 years ago, and you can see that, for example, China in less than a generation lifted over 500, 600 million people out of poverty, but they started somewhere. Singapore, Taiwan, all of these countries that have recently industrialized, they all have started somewhere, and all of them, the starting point is industrial development on a massive scale, continued decade after decade, and that's how they got to the point where they are today. So I don't think there's something special about them, and there's something unspecial about us Africans. I think that what we have been missing is a tool which enables us to consolidate the market that we have. And that's exactly what the African Continental Free Trade Area presents. It presents us with a tool, a legal framework for a consolidated market, something that we've been lacking for the last almost 60 years now. 54 countries have signed it. Only 1 country still has not signed. And as of last week, Friday, 39 countries have ratified it. We are still of those 39, 3 are still to deposit their instruments of ratification, but they've taken the most important step, which is that their parliaments have approved that they deposit the instrument of ratification. We are waiting for Tanzania to deposit her instrument of ratification. And so I'm very, very happy at the very positive signals from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Industry and Trade, that certainly Tanzania is at the last phase of going through the domestic legal process for ratification. So with 39 countries, I think it's a very good start. This is the fastest instrument in the African Union to be ratified, which to me signals a political will and of course legal commitment for those who have deposited their instruments of ratification. But the test will of course be implementation. That is where the big challenge will be. And what I've seen is that it is incredibly difficult under normal circumstances. It's even more difficult under circumstances of a pandemic to focus on trade and to keep trade as in the foremost minds of governments, because governments are now preoccupied with fighting the pandemic, correctly so, saving African lives, correctly so. And so we've been having to redouble our efforts to keep the hope of this agreement alive and to make sure that it continues to be on the agenda of governments across the African continent. But certainly I'm very encouraged by the political will and the political commitment across the African continent. I think many Africans, millions and millions of Africans are tired of being poor. We are tired of being, as I said earlier, on the periphery of the global economy. We understand that many countries I go to understand that as a single individual country, the chances of success are limited. But if we integrate our market, if we consolidate ourselves into this market of 1.3 billion people, that becomes a very, very attractive investment proposition. And so the motivation is economic development. Countries want to get out of the condition that they are in, and countries want to reach a higher level of income for their citizens, for consumers, access to competitive and reasonably affordable goods and services. And of course for governments, it is a desire for an overall economic development path that is tied to the rest of the African continent, and that seeks to make sure that Africa as a whole develops and gets out of this condition that we have been in for many years. But I want to stress that it's going to take time. It takes a long time for a trade agreement to produce results. We know from the experience of other parts of the world how long it takes for trade agreements to produce results, for small, medium enterprises to see results, for consumers to see results. Usually in trade agreements, the main beneficiaries are the big corporations because they have the capacity to expand into new markets immediately. And so we must be patient with the process. As hopeful as we are, and as much as we want to see results in a relatively short space of time, we must be mindful of the fact that trade agreements, by their very nature, they take a while to bear results. Well, the point I've been making is that when the country is ready, is when the country should proceed with the ratification process to conclude it. Because ratification is a very domestic process. There's a political component, there's obviously a legal component from a legislator point of view, there's a civil society component, you have to consult quite widely, and there has to be a very high degree of comfort that everybody is ready for the country to undertake these very, very far-reaching obligations. And some of these obligations require deep reforms that have to be undertaken, in this case, economic reforms. And so a country has to be ready for that. You can't, as a country, buckle down to pressure from others, from outside. And so I believe, from what the briefings I have received, I believe Tanzania has done all of the consultative work that is required and is almost at the point of readiness to finalize the process. There are benefits, certainly. Tanzania will have access to a much wider market, in West Africa, North Africa, Central Africa. The market is much bigger. The services sector will benefit. The export sector will benefit. So certainly the benefits are there, and I believe that Tanzania will be able to make use of this expanded export market on the African continent. The countries, some of the countries that have not ratified, the delay really has been that their parliaments have not been sitting because of the COVID situation. Some because of the backlog in their parliaments, the process is in motion. For others, it is by nature of the domestic legal requirements that they take a long time. But where there's a trade concern, a substantive trade concern, what I've been hearing is on rules of origin. Are they stringent enough to prevent transshipment? What are we going to do about third country goods that are coming into the market and potentially may cause distortions in the market? Do we have the capacity, the enforcement capacity as a continent and individual countries to protect domestic markets? These are some of the concerns from countries who have not yet ratified. But as I said earlier, I am not particularly concerned, because once a country is ready, then it will deposit its instrument and it will join the process. In the agreement, we make provision for what we call a variable geometry. In other words, those who are ready can start implementing and can move forward. And so the countries that are ready will start implementation. We already have Ghana, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya who have the customs procedures in place. The next stage after ratification is for a country to establish its customs procedures. And already these countries have signaled that. There are countries who have ratified who are saying we still need more time to establish the customs procedures for AfCFTA implementation. And that's perfectly understandable. So we're not in this for the short term. We're in this for the long term. It took the European Union precisely 72 years to be at this point of depth of the market and integration. And so similarly, I think we should expect that this is something that is going to take time. But we do owe it to future generations to start now and to start integrating our market now, so that in 30 to 40 years' time, our continent is a much better place for our children and great-grandchildren. No, not at all. On the contrary, our relationship is complementary. For example, in the COMESA Treaty, it states it very, very clearly that COMESA as a free trade area is a building block towards a continental free trade area. And similarly, in the agreement establishing the AfCFTA, we say that regional economic communities are the building blocks of the AfCFTA. And so there is a complementary role between the AfCFTA Secretariat and the regional economic communities. And we cooperate in a range of different areas: customs procedures, trade facilitation, transit of goods. These are important areas that we are equally concerned, that we want to see progress in. Of course, one day Africa will become a customs union. That is set clearly in the Abuja Treaty, that the next phase of integration for Africa should be that Africa should be a customs union. And at that point, we then, of course, will have to look at regional economic communities, their mandate in relation to what would then be a customs union, an African Union customs union, if I can call it that. But we're not there yet, and it will take some time before we reach that point. But for now, our relationship is complementary with the regional economic communities. We work together, and I have met with the head of COMESA, the head of ECOWAS, the head of ECAS, the head of EAC. So we have a very, very strong complementary working relationship. I think both can be done at the same time. But I must say, I have seen up and down the African continent, I have seen very, very encouraging signs of trade networks, trade facilitating infrastructure being established. For example, in West Africa, if you go to the Port of Lome, from the Port of Lome, there's a trade corridor that connects Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. And this is very important for the economies of the landlocked countries that I've just mentioned. In Central Africa, the government of the DRC is working to establish dry ports in a number of strategic border posts so that there is a connectivity between Southern Africa and Central Africa going in towards North Africa. In North Africa, Egypt is building a corridor, a trade corridor, that will connect Cairo to Cape Town. A very, very ambitious project of connecting the entire continent. Similarly, there are arteries from Cairo to West Africa and East Africa. So there is a lot of effort being made to improve trade facilitating infrastructure. Of course, it's nowhere near where it should be because of resource limitations. However, I do see that even though the infrastructure deficit in Africa is a little over $100 billion, which is an opportunity to invest, there are active steps that governments are taking to make sure that they invest in infrastructure. And so these trade corridors are very, very important for making sure that we do boost intra-Africa trade and that the flow of trade is made more efficient across regions and within regions. And so if we don't have in the next 10 years a significant investment in infrastructure, it will be very difficult to boost intra-Africa trade. And I think many governments around the world are conscious, around Africa, are very much aware of that. And that's why there's so much investment that I'm seeing in infrastructure across the regions of the continent. There are, of course, pockets of regions or countries where there's a continued need for even more infrastructure development than we see now. And those governments have to do more for infrastructure development in their regions or in their countries. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at when the pandemic started, global supply chains were disrupted. And when that disruption happened, Africa suffered more than any other region because we are so reliant on global supply chains. And so when we did not have access to germ-killing products, to the vaccines, to the ventilators, and a range of other equipment that is needed to fight the pandemic, we suffered. We also learned that our continued over-reliance on minerals, on oil, is a key weakness. And the third thing we realized is that intellectual property rights must be reviewed to enable Africa to produce vaccines on the African continent and to enable us to establish a generic drug industry on the African continent. As a secretariat, and certainly I am committed to this, we must accelerate the establishment of value chains, and pharmaceuticals has to be one of them, so that Africans have access to vaccines, Africans have access to affordable health care, and we know from the experience of India that actually the generic drug industry does make a difference in terms of access to public health and affordability of quality public health. Is that where we effectively implement this agreement, by the year 2035, we have a very unique opportunity to lift 100 million Africans out of poverty, 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty, and 70 million Africans out of moderate poverty. And we can increase Africa's GDP by up to $450 billion. Women in small, medium enterprises and women-owned businesses will be the biggest beneficiary of this agreement where we implement it effectively. Her Excellency, the President has unfortunately for her, a particular responsibility because a lot of young men, a lot of young women are looking up to her as the only female leader on the continent. And so that comes with expectations, particularly from women in trade. And so we think that there clearly is a role for her and for Tanzania to play in promoting the gender dimension of this trade agreement, and in promoting and in making sure that we, in the Secretariat and myself and my colleagues, that we take concrete affirmative action to make sure that women in trade do benefit from this agreement, that it doesn't benefit only the big corporations.